Why not? I'll start it out. Good afternoon. I hope everybody's feeling good at 1 o'clock. We switched up the time a little bit today because I'm sure that after 8 or 9 hours of consistent Zoom calls, everyone just can't wait to skip dinner and get on another Zoom call for a social event. So it's like, you know what, let's do it in the middle of the day. Let's have a little more fun. That wasn't enough for me. So my name's Alex Dubovoy. For those of you who don't know me, I think I know everybody here. But if you don't know me, my name's Alex Dubovoy. I'm a recruiter, and I have no interest in recruiting anybody today. My interest today is to meet people, tell you guys what we're all about. More importantly, get everybody talking. So Q&A is going to be great. Throw your questions in the chat, and Ned, you'll see them as you go. If you feel like answering them real time, cool. If you want to answer them towards the end because the solutions present themselves, that's great.
And I will do my, yeah, and Alex, I'll do my best to get them. I'm going to be juggling a lot of windows as I'm, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but I'm going to be doing some window juggling while I do this. So, hey, Brandon, if you're there, just keep an eye on that as well. And feel free, Brandon, to interrupt me if you think I've missed something or there's a good question that's hanging out.
All right, we'll do.
Warrants a response. So in terms of CrossCode, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what it is we're building and the story of how we got to where we are today. But it's an interesting one, full of anecdotes, warnings, and other things. And part of what we'll try to illustrate in this presentation, besides our product and such, is the importance of DevOps, the importance of standards and process, as well as real warning signs that you may be in more trouble with a code base or a set of technologies than you might realize, especially if you're doing any kind of complicated or significant development. And so what do I mean by complicated and significant development? You're building a complete thing. There's a complete architecture. It might have multiple services, microservices. If you're dealing with, for example, anything that from a IDE standpoint has multiple projects, et cetera, has dependencies across one or more data storage technologies. That could be relational database, graph, NoSQL databases, document-centric stuff, et cetera. And if you have anything that's looking like that, and you are having real problems either maintaining, correcting issues, extending functionality, I'm going to say something that, at least in recent years, has been somewhat heretical. You might need to consider a rewrite. And part of that is understanding what is your starting point issue. Is it, okay, we have a bug that's been reported, or there's an issue that, say, the IT service management people have noted, and subsequently they've logged a ticket and you're trying to address it? Or is it more fundamental than that? Is it something bigger and it's taking you weeks or even months to turn around changes and such? So with that being said, first off, I just want to, I lost my intro slide. Oh man, Jen's going to be upset about that. I'll just introduce who I am. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for CrossCode. I'm responsible for the overall software engineering and development of the product. I also have on the phone, on this meetup with me, Brandon Tilke, who is our Chief Software Architect, and he has worked in lockstep with me through this entire saga. And so, Brandon, if you want, you can say hi, or I'll just keep going.
Hello.
Hello. Okay. So really quickly, what is our product? What are we building? Well, the best way to think of it is as a directory of dependencies and relationships. So from method to column, all the way up to platform, a single source of truth around all of these various things that you see on the screen here. So internal dependencies, microservices, data storage. And we don't necessarily do all of these today, but over the next 2 quarters, we'll be doing most of them. And part of this is about really taking that notion of being able to see all the way down to code level and then connect that all the way out so that you can see in broad strokes what this really means. So when we say platforms, what are we referring to? We're referring to systems like ServiceNow, SAP, et cetera. And when we talk about application code, we mean all the way down to source entities, classes, methods, fields, and so forth. So the idea being that no longer is it a mystery, for example, when a deployment has occurred, because we'll audit all of this stuff. It's no longer a mystery as to what the situation is that led to an outage, or where you need to go, where you need to start to address that problem. And eventually that will trace all the way back into the DevOps stack so that you can go from, we've got something read on an ITSM dashboard, through to, okay, this is the code that changed, this is the method, or if it's a database, this is the column where there was a change in data type or what have you. And then this is the impact analysis around that. And then subsequently, we can also then trace back that code. We will be able to trace back that code entry all the way to the repo, through to the ticketing from a backlog standpoint, so that ultimately you can do, from a continuous improvement standpoint, a root cause analysis as to how this even came to be. Because ultimately, if you think about it from the standpoint of the Toyota way, if you've got a car that's coming down the assembly line and you keep having misaligned bits and pieces or trim that doesn't fit right, it's not enough to just fix that or to go talk to the line operator and say, hey, why do we keep putting this on? You need to go all the way back to engineering to understand the decision that led to that piece of trim that doesn't fit right. Not so that you can wag your finger at people or assign blame, but so that you can correct the problem at the root so it doesn't happen again. So that's sort of the broad scope of what we're trying to do. All in one place, accessible to people and systems. This is a big part of it, by the way. While we are going to have our pane of glass and it will do neat things, we think a big part of this is making sure that other systems in the DevOps stack, in the IT management side, et cetera, are able to access this and better inform themselves about what's actually going on. And you're going to see that, especially if you are a ServiceNow customer, you're going to see this over the next quarter as we're building this out. So you'll be able to actually say, okay, was the problem in a script in ServiceNow? Is it an application plugin? Is it the application that the workflow is wrapping out on the outside, et cetera, et cetera. Before I go on, by the way, I just want to ask a quick question. I don't know if Alex, are we doing sort of asking questions and seeing if people can plug it into the chat?
Yeah, exactly. If anybody has questions, throw them into the chat, and Ned, I'll leave it at your discretion as to answer now or after the presentation. Also, one quick point. Don't forget, everybody, stick around at the end. We have Amazon gift cards that we're giving away, 4 of them. So your odds are high because no one from Verity or CrossCode can win them. So just saying.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to throw a question out, and people, feel free to answer. Just note if you have if you are using some portion of the ServiceNow stack in your environment, because we'd be very interested to know that, just in terms of how, and if you've deployed any of the DevOps pieces in that world, since they are making a big push there. So just wanted to throw that out there, since I'm sort of interested to know if this audience has had to confront or deal with. I shouldn't say that because I don't want to make anyone feel bad about their ServiceNow environment. If you've worked with and are ensconced in that world, noted in the chat, we'd be very interested to know. So there was a problem though. In January of 2020, we didn't create the product I just described. We were supposed to be ready for prime time. There had been a lot of money raised, a lot of things had happened. But what we had in fact created, and full disclosure, because I've got to deflect on this point. Brandon and I were not involved in the creation of the original code base of which I am referring. You can think of it as we were brought in to address that code base and the issues that were going on there. But the big issue is, we showed up and Brandon and I they were like, oh, here's a cool thing. We're ready to go. Let's deliver this, get this out to customers. And yeah, that didn't go very well. And ultimately, it was because we created the product that desperately needed the product that we just described on that previous slide. So it was not, in fact, actually the product that we said it was. So what were some of the problems? Massively convoluted architecture, huge dependency mess, one of which there's nothing more frustrating than working on a dependency discovery product that has massive dependency problems. I can tell you that's a pretty frustrating situation. And ultimately, it didn't really work the way we needed it to work. It did do some stuff, and And conceptually, it showed what it could do to some degree, but it just had huge issues and wasn't extensible. I'm going to just very quickly check the chat here because I see some things popping in there. Okay. So where we started. So why was it like this? So first off is the first revision code base was evolved from rapid prototyping. It was iterating on a basis from a feature standpoint that was extremely, shall we say, disconnected and was pushed to try to evolve without a step being taken back to discuss architecture. So that's a pretty serious problem in and of itself, but it's not one that's fatal. There's plenty of products that evolve that way and can survive it. But the issue is at some point, you're going to have to start addressing that problem. And unfortunately, this one, it just kept going and going and going. And part of the problem was that there was an attempt to address these issues by throwing more and more people at the problem. So our current development team is a tiny fraction of the team that we had at that time. The team that we had at that time was in, Greg, what was it? It was at least like 45 people, right?
Yes, we had 45 people, I think, in Noida and like 15 in Lyon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we had another whole nother team out of Lyon. So
yes,
it really,
we're close to 50.
Yeah, so something in the, yeah, it was a lot of people. And the problem is, as anyone will tell you, development teams don't scale that way. You can't scale a team by just adding lots of people to it. You also have to make sure if you're going to try to do that. So if you look at a company, a large company like Microsoft, where I worked for six plus years, development teams could get up to 200 people, et cetera. Maybe not quite that large, but that included tons of people who aren't coding, included orchestrators, program and product managers, development managers, all sorts of people to help coordinate those efforts and make that large team effective. That requires, among other things, very serious commitment to process, including what we call today DevOps and such. So that's a big issue. So our scope was also very feature specific, meaning we would keep adding features, but we weren't thinking sort of coherently about the bigger whole. And as feature creep occurred, as it always does, complexity started to grow exponentially. And I do mean exponentially. And I'll show you, actually, Brandon's going to show you in a second what exponential complexity manifests itself as. It was heavily reliant on evaluative and conditional logic, lots of if-else statements. Data was runtime constructed. This is something that I'm personally, I'll tell you, is a warning sign of a problem. Your data model should encompass ultimately what the elements of data are that you're manipulating and working with in a symmetric fashion, meaning I should not get something out if I'm profiling something, if I'm capturing some data from a source. Shouldn't go through this big massaging process that looks like an ETL system and then come out on the other side completely different and different naming standards and structured with some things over here and some things over there. And then for presentation or manipulation from a user experience standpoint, it shouldn't go through yet another set of transformations. It should be fairly symmetric. What you get out of whatever it is you're profiling or whatever transactions going on should be stored in a way that's relatively symmetrical and ultimately how you display. If your data model doesn't look like that, you got some really big problems. Ultimately, we were only storing what we needed. And to construct views, we could only do it in a way that was sort of predetermined. And this became really a big problem. So effectively, our graph was computed. We had interesting information, but as you can imagine, when you're trying to deal with dependencies, which as you evaluate and as you get further and further into the things customers want to see and so forth, this expansion of a data model and this expansion of the things that you're showing from a relationship standpoint has to be able to grow and do so in a way that doesn't break things, meaning you have to have extensibility. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a bit. So we couldn't see what we couldn't see. We had massive complexity, required 4 months of discovery just for us to start figuring out, what was really going on with regards to our reconstituted team. We started with that standard practice of refactor, don't rewrite. And I'll tell you, the industry is too averse to rewrites. I am willing to bet, especially as people start using our product to sort of get a better view of what's actually going on from a code-based standpoint or from a dependency standpoint. I think we may start to unblock this notion that you can't rewrite. Today, nobody wants to take that on because of the potential knock-on consequences to various dependent systems. They don't know what the dependencies are. They don't know how that impact is going to manifest itself, so on and so forth. So ultimately, we've gotten to a point where we talk about this need for digital, what's the big phrase? It's digital transformation, right? But in reality, we're on many large organizations and even small teams, you're blocked. You don't want to fiddle with something because it works right now. And if we start messing with it, the implications are going to be huge. In reality, a lot of this stuff needs to get rewritten. A lot of it needs to get refactored. And we talk about breaking monoliths and wrapping them with microservices and all this stuff today. But that's not going to entirely solve the problem. So ultimately, this cost us months and significant capital trying to fix the unfixable. And in real terms, $540,000 in actual accountable capital, minimum of 4 months of opportunity time, investor partner, and customer credibility. And Brandon will tell you we almost lost our sanity as well. It was pretty nuts. So before I go into in a little bit more into the product, I want to talk about, I know this is an eye chart. This is not intended for everyone on here to read it, but I wanted to talk about warning signs, meaning I've spent much of my career, holding true to that adage that you refactor, you fix, but you don't rewrite. And I think ultimately there are warning signs when, no, you may really be up against some serious problems. So first off, I will ask this question. People can post it in the chat, but I'd be interested in how many on the in the session have actually attempted a full-up rewrite or have had to try to tackle this problem when they've come to a conclusion that something just isn't salvageable from a code-based standpoint. And I'd be interested to know what people's thoughts are. With that being said, here are some warning signs. And I would say of this list of the things I'm going to rattle off here, any 2 or 3 of these things per list, you are probably in need of skip the refactoring, go right to planning stages for a rewrite. And I see there is a chat here. Yes to rewrites. I would love to know more about your experience with the rewrites and how you took that on, because I think it does take a lot of, I'll put it this way, that's definitely an interesting decision when you get to that point where you're making that where you make that decision.
It really becomes a political capital thing too, right?
Yeah, and Anthony, Anthony says, yes, more than once, but I've lost more arguments to rewrite than I have won. And you know what? That's true. I've experienced that as well, because the perception is that the rewrite is an extremely dangerous activity. And in fact, I think in a world without proper dependency and relationship mapping, I think it is. I think there's a lot of truth to that too. But there's also the hidden risk that, again, comes back to that you don't know what you don't know. And I'll show you an example of how bad that can be in one small area in just a minute. So a couple of these warning signs here. So if your DevOps is in disarray, this is almost immediately a sign that you've got real problems. For example, is there no single build pipeline or infrastructure that is used to build the thing that constitutes the application or product or project that is the thing that you're working on? Meaning, do you have 5 different systems for building 5 different components? Does it only build on one person's machine, like their extra special gold computer? I've seen this so many times, and I can't believe it's still a problem. When we walked in, this was a problem, where we had this one dude, he could build it, nobody else could get this thing to build. Do you see, and this isn't a joke, by the way, does the build process in one of the scripts have a relative path RMRF? Brandon, what happened to you when you first tried to build our legacy product?
Yeah, the first attempt wiped out my entire system and resulted in reloading everything. So,
and it's interesting. We probably should have heeded that right then and there, right? So on to code, no comments. That's a big problem. I know people talk about today about self-documenting code. When you get into very complicated manipulation of data, especially if it's multi-stage, there's idempotency involved, concurrency and so forth, you got to have some comments in there. You got to know what this method is, what it does. It doesn't mean you have to get crazy and pedantic. I've seen some people where they comment every single line. That's probably not necessary, but at least some indication of what it is, especially so that just from a mental tracking standpoint, you can understand, okay, I came from this method that was doing this, and now I'm in this class in this method that it called. And obviously, if that's what that method does, then this must have some part of that. Naming conventions. This is a big one. If every single class has different naming conventions, every method's named, oddly, etc., that's a problem. Bizarre namespacing. If the names used in the namespace don't match what they do. For example, we had one class called, it was called process instantiation. And it was very interesting because as I looked into this, none of the methods in this class had anything to do with instantiating processes, not even remotely. So at that point, you're looking in your code base and you're going, well, that must be about process initialization. And it turns out it has nothing to do with that. Bad coding practices. Everything passed on a var or weird convoluted string manipulation. This one is a big warning sign. If you are seeing var to var to var to var, meaning I call a class method, that calls another class method, calls another class, gets to the method that ultimately, say, connects to an endpoint and retrieves a JSON document and then reads the whole thing into a var, does some manipulation, passes it back on a var, et cetera. And this is particularly egregious in the .NET world. You'll see this. That's a really big problem. And for one thing, it makes it incredibly difficult to then properly instantiate from the caller's perspective, proper object instantiation. So because you're taking something that's essentially runtime, essentially a runtime instantiated type, and trying to work with it in a world that in theory should be type safe and fully properly constructed from a constructor standpoint, you can't do it. So another one, speaking of constructors, is implementing mechanism logic. If you see, and we had a particularly egregious violation of this, if you see a constructor where instead of just setting up an object, it's actually taking on, as part of the constructor logic, carrying out actual actions, that is a particularly significant problem. And we had one case where the constructor logic was actually going and attempted to do a download. I kid you not, really happened. And the issue was they had attempted to thread, they were attempting to create concurrency by threading, and their theory was that the caller would call the method to start the download, and then the constructor, they could call it multiple times and the constructor would create objects for downloading, right? And they thought that that was concurrency. What they didn't know is behind the scenes that calling the constructor blocks. It's going to block and it's going to become serialized or sequential, meaning it's not going to allow the next object creation while it's doing the download. So it completely defeated the purpose, and they had the path of flow completely inverse from what it needed to be. So if you see stuff like that, that's a problem. And if you see massively nested if statements and for loop abuse, that's a problem. And if you see anything that looks like what I'm about to show you, which is hundreds of lines of methods and functions, this is a big problem. And I'm actually going to show you just for a second, Brandon. If I'm going to pass the baton to you.
All right.
And you'll have to pass it back to me. And well, that's odd. I don't know if
Anthony, you said you lost more arguments to rewrite than you won. Can you tell me about one you won and one you lost?
Well, I think Anthony's going to type that in. Hey, Brandon, real quick, are you able to share?
I am not.
Hey, Alex, would you be able to hand that to Brandon, because it doesn't look like I can. Oh well, never mind. We'll move on. It's too bad because we had a hell of a method to show you. It was really something. And then finally, circular references. And then I think the other last thing I mentioned is ad hoc borked data model, no naming conventions, et cetera. So select any of these from any 2 or 3 from this list, and I guarantee you probably need a rewrite. So even without a really cool tool to show you what's going on in the product, et cetera, your first order of business is around DevOps. Meaning before you start figuring out how to rewrite, or even if you need to rewrite, if you've got the DevOps issues that are a mess, start there, because that's going to very quickly illustrate where the problem actually lies as you start to try to wrap better practices and such around this. So first off, continuous delivery is the goal. And we have just recently finally gotten truly to a continuous delivery model, which, I have to, give a round of applause to Brandon around that, since he was responsible for much of the engineering to make that happen. Continuous integration, though, is not optional, meaning at the very least, you need to have the CI portion of that down. If you have people who are just off in la la land with private branches, or just have things on their local machine, they're not pushing up regularly, and there's no notion of progression from integration to master and so forth. If you don't have any of that, and you're not putting some kind of control around that, you've got a very serious problem. In fact, that was one of the first things we encountered. Integrated testing is really important, and we have gotten to the point where now we have this, but unit integration and functional, and specifically you're trying to push towards having continuous functional testing on the other side of it. So for example, today, as we build the product, it goes through, and as part of that functional testing, we eat our own dog food. We profile our own code. And in fact, what that's allowed us to do is to start to see the problems. And in fact, we've caught very significant problems through our own tool profiling itself. So wherever you can, eat your own dog food. But if nothing else, you got to make sure that you are at least attempting to do some level of testing as part of that continuous build process. So what do we have today? Brandon, I'll let you talk to this real quick.
All right, so we have a continuous integration kind of setup. We're using Jenkins on the back end, and as developers check in code, it kind of goes through everything you would expect, having read the Jez Humble, Dave Farley continuous deployment book. Everything is built. It's then deployed to QA. All of our automated testing is done, unit integration functional tests. And then we have a full test suite with the output from that. And then Rob, who's on the call, actually built a beautiful deployment pipeline that can package it all up at the end of that and slap a version on it and make it available in production. So.
Hey, Brandon, by the way, if you do want to share something, I'm sorry I stepped away. Feel free. I made you, you can share a screen, or if there's anything you want to throw up there.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
We lost the moment to show the 800-line method.
Man, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Actually,
I hate killing the moment.
Just throw up that 800-line method for 1 second, because this is one of the most spectacular things we found as part of our process of evaluating. This, just so you understand, just point out where this method starts and where it begins and ends, because I think it's
so the method
amazing.
Starts here on line 330, and as you can see, it wraps up on line 871, and it massively the biggest portion of it is the 500 lines of this for loop, and which contains other loops inside of other loops, and it's mostly nested if-else statements. So it's essentially, if you think of a Plinko board from The Price is Right, it's that, but implemented in code, because we really didn't know where anything would come out once it got into this method.
What is it you call it? It's deterministically non-deterministic?
Yes, yeah.
So it's a pretty amazing thing that occurred there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, as we went through and we had to try to understand what this meant. It would have helped if we had some visual way to understand the implications of what these methods meant and just how big a problem it actually was. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to talk about where we are today. And I've taken you through sort of the things you should be applying, things you should be doing. If you start to detect that you have these warning signs that there's something really, really wrong, and subsequently, where are we today? So completely new second gen code base. 4.5 months to viable release. We are in the process of the releases that we're doing right now. They're early, but they do work and they do interesting stuff. And it's going to be on a continuous refinement basis, since we are doing continuous delivery. Every 2 weeks we do a release, and with that came a new fully graph-based data model. So relational directed object graph, and I'll explain what the relationality means versus just a straight directed graph in a second. But it's well-defined and extensible. It's symmetrical, as I mentioned before, and that doesn't mean it's perfectly symmetrical, but the goal is to try to make sure that what you're profiling correlates to what you see in the data model, which correlates to what you see on the screen, that it's not wildly different in each one of those places. And the architecture itself is pluggable. So Rob and John, I don't know if John's on, they're two of our engineers, they did a phenomenal job of making sure that architecturally this thing was extensible. And this notion that you could have multiple plugins, both front end and back end, that could essentially work at various stages of our pipeline of analyzing and massaging data and then getting it into our graph, into our data model, and the various interesting sort of chicken or the egg and many caravan situations that occur in that world when you're trying to do that, making sure that it was architected to handle that. Additionally, that means that we're going to be able to allow customers and partners to extend it. So for example, for those of you out there who are dealing with these issues, you've got, let's say you've got a specialized situation from a language standpoint. This happens where maybe there's some customization to a framework, and we're not able to handle that, but you'll be able to put a plugin potentially that does handle that situation down the road as we document that and make that something that's accessible to customers and partners. And the API is vastly simplified, and it's a lot faster and more efficient. So in fact, I think I won't put Rob on the spot, but I think we're talking about in certain cases going from many hours to do an analysis of, say, a complex multi-war nested jar, all that Java application, to 30 seconds to a couple of minutes. Now, obviously, more complexity, that goes up, but the difference is, when I say orders of magnitude, I mean that in the correct sense. So what that means is that we use it. We can see where to start. And so I'm just going to jump in really quickly, and I'm going to show you the actual data model. I'm not going to jump into our top level UI. I'm actually going to go to the low level data here so that you can see this. We will actually be adding the user interface element you see here that I'm going to be demoing through is the Neo4 Viz UI in the Neo4j console, but we're actually going to be pulling that in and implementing a variation of that directly in our UI along with several other visualizations. But I want to show you what the data actually looks like. So give me 1 second while I juggle this here. And where? Got too many screens. There we go. So what I'm going to do here is I basically did a simple query to just match on class entities to a table. And this is actually looking at a combination. So one of the things about the way our product works that's different in terms of its profiling than, say, a standard static source analysis tool or what have you, is our primary goal is to actually analyze what is deployed. Now, in certain cases, we may analyze a combination of source from a source repo or static source file. In other cases, we may be doing something more dynamic. I'll talk about in a minute sort of the different modalities or different methods in which we capture data and will be capturing data going forward. But the goal is to show you what it looks like in an actual deployed state. So for example, this is stuff from our QA environment that we use for testing, but this is actually deployed, meaning there's the application, the old code base is sitting there running, with the back end up and running, and then there's an actual, database server, et cetera. And in our main UI, you can actually just see the applications and such and what they touch. But here I'm going to go sort of low level because I think from a from a development standpoint, we know that a lot of people are going to want to look at the data as it's represented sort of in its pure form. So what I'm doing here is the first thing I'm doing is I'm expanding the Java class entity here that represents this class. And so this is all, so right here we start to see, oh boy, this is not so good just from a standpoint of looking at the classes, fields, and so forth. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually expand the assets table here. Now, mind you, I haven't gone all the way up to the database and looked at all the tables and such. In this particular case, I'm just looking, all we're looking at here are one method, initially one class to one table. So what we start to see here is, boy, we've got some already starting to see some pretty interesting problems in terms of, the complexity of this stuff. But, it's not too odd yet. But let's say that we need to address this ID field right here. And this ID field here, or this ID column here, represents some important data. We need to tighten up the security on it, or we need to tighten up, we want to understand from an impact analysis standpoint what this means. And so one of the things you can do in our main UI, which I don't have in front of me at the moment, is you can go and you can actually select an element and you can say, just do an impact analysis and show me all the things that are potentially dependent on this. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ID, I'm going to take this ID column here, and I'm just going to expand it. And all of a sudden, we start to see a pretty serious problem erupting here. And what we're seeing now is we're starting to see that there is a massive number of foreign key references back to this one column. And not only that, we're seeing that they're not consistently named. Here it's called asset ID. Here it's named outbound and inbound, which, Brandon, if you saw this, would this concern you that outbound and inbound ultimately resolve to the same column?
It's generally concerning, yeah.
It's not a good thing. But what we're able to do, and by the way, if I look at this asset, for example, if I look at, for example, ID, you'll notice down at the bottom that the identity includes the JDBC connection string to this. So this isn't just a hypothetical database connection. And we're not just looking at the database scheme and the database dependencies that are going on. We're also looking at this as it relates to code. So as we come back out, okay, and we have another table here, and I'm just going to go ahead and expand that. This is going to create more fun here. And we're going to expand that out. And then I'm going to take a look at this particular Java class entity here, which we haven't even looked at before, and I'm going to expand that out. And as we start to do this, we start to see just, oh wow, look at what's happening here. Now, and mind you, all this data is there. This is not actually a case where there's some magic processing going on right now. That was all done before. So all these references are already present. And what we start to see is the unbelievable knock-on effect if I touch this. Now, had we had, and if I keep expanding this out, what you'll see is, if you see behind me on my screen here on the video, you'll see this enormous, that's a 30-inch Apple Cinema display right there. And I can't fit everything on this. And this really encompasses our data model and encompasses the core services, doesn't even include the agent frameworks and such for our old code base. So what would this have told me if I had this in January? We would have looked at an instance of one of those crazy 400-line methods. We then would have looked at this and said, there are so many classes, so many methods, and then we have these bizarre data model problems. And believe me, we would have come to the conclusion very rapidly that anything that we're trying to fix is going to have massive, massive issues in trying to address it. So ultimately what that would mean is our starting point, as Greg sort of started off with that whole notion of where do you start? Well, here, if you see this, you start with a rewrite. And we would have made that decision easily months before we did. But when we had to go through and sort of discover this problem to sort of map in our heads, and we even had some source analysis tools, but they just didn't give us the connecting the dots between all of these different systems. Ultimately, and all of these different components within the application, the data model, database, et cetera. The ultimate result was we needed to start a rewrite far earlier, but we couldn't see it. We had to go through a manual discovery. And by the way, the stuff we're doing in the ServiceNow space and such around a lot of what we're in terms of our customer interactions right now in that space are around really helping them from a ServiceNow instance migration up to the latest versions. Understand again where to start. What are the things that are dependent on one another? What scripts have been modified? What scripts haven't? And by the way, we store for all of this. We store auditing information. So you can think of it almost like you can think of it almost like what is it called in what do they use in the Mac for the backup?
A time machine.
Time machine. That's it. It's almost like time machine, wherein we can actually see an audit of what's changed. And by the way, you can click to go see where in the dependency map that is, et cetera, and do an analysis. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you can't see these relationships, if you can't map these out and understand the impact, it's very hard to understand where you're going to start or how significant your problems really are. Very quickly, I also want to talk about the nature of directionality and such in this. So I mentioned that there's this notion of a relational directed object graph. What you'll notice is that we have different types of relationship entities, and those relationships, these aren't just lines like in Visio where a thing points to a thing. These actually tell you something about the nature of that relationship, including, for example, we have container relationships, we have referential relationships. That's a sort of referential component. And this ultimately allows us to understand where there are direct references here, as well as implicit dependency issues here. It's effectively really gives you an interesting way to understand how this stuff is actually relating. And then last but not least, as we go forward and we get these bigger and bigger relationship maps built, we have this notion of confidences, so that as we're calculating impact, so if you do an impact analysis in our UI, for example, we may say, okay, we're 100% on, say this one right here, you'll see there's a confidence value there, it's 100%. But we're only 80% on this because the detection logic that we're running, it can't be 100% certain. So maybe it's 80% and so forth. And as you transitively walk a dependency situation through each one of these relationships, we subsequently will calculate what the actual impact from a confidence level is. So that's a quick low-level dive into the data model and what we're doing. I will come back over now to my deck. First, before I go any further, I'm gonna check the chat because I know there's a couple things in here. So we had, says, I'm morbidly curious about the method from Victoria. Well, Victoria, hopefully we showed you the method, at least in some, a little bit. By the way, we are considering, and again, there's a lot of things that we have to do before we can do this. We are actually considering releasing our old code base as open source for people to look at, both for testing purposes. I could see a lot of different scenarios besides our own because we use it for that purpose, as well as just more, satisfying people's morbid curiosity. Anthony had mentioned that there's a rewrite win, was to combine multiple small and outdated apps into our new consolidated platform. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. When you can get that seems to be a pattern where if you can get things that are sort of quantifiable in terms of both what they are, how dated they are, the risk factors that involve the sort of risk profile of them being outdated, and then you can build a good case for consolidating that into something that is a bigger, better whole. That seems to be a fairly common pattern right now. What we don't see, I think, a lot of is, oh boy, we've got this major main line of business application, and it's a horrendous menagerie of 20 years of code. And you've got things wrapping things to try to make it modern or look modern. But in reality, it's, as you start to go back through the layers, I think that's where today nobody, in my opinion, I think nobody wants to tackle that stuff. It's very hard to deal with the big apps. If you've ever looked, oh, no one from Microsoft's on here. But if you've ever looked at Windows 10, you can kind of see the problem there as well. Now, Windows, from an operating system standpoint, is a pretty sophisticated piece of software, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. But how long are we going to be waiting for this control panel to settings thing to get finished? I mean, today we still have a control panel and we still have a settings panel. And, you know, it's because of this, you know, this COM-based CPL architecture for the control panel applets. And it's just this never end. Like someday I would just like Windows 10 to have one single control panel or settings. That would be terrific. But again, grabbing that and doing it all as one fell swoop was just too big and too difficult. And at least give Microsoft credit for, you know, trying to get to a more rational approach to that as it was getting out of control. But by and large, most of these large apps, most of these large sections of code, even within an app, often it's pretty hard to get buy-in to go and address those. And usually it's because you just don't know what the impact is going to be. So that's one of the key sort of driving factors behind why we're building what we're building. So what does all of this mean in terms of our product, and how do we see this fitting in? So first off, we are a DevOps tool in a broad sense, and we're intended to integrate on the DevOps side. Yes, it looks like that this would be something that's heavily directed toward developers, but it's not just developers. It is really intended for anyone, and I take a very broad view of DevOps. I take that sort of movement notion of what DevOps means, which really is all about unifying all of this stuff around common process, mechanisms, tools, so that you can get to ultimately to continuous delivery. And that encompasses what we traditionally think of as IT ops. So we see our product not just as being valuable in the DevOps space, but also in the IT ops space. It's absolutely, and you'll see this in our main UI when you get the product, and we are offering, I believe, either 90 days for business or a year for personal. You'll see when you get our product that there is a UI, and it's intended for sort of high level to mid-level usage, and as a starting point to understanding the thing you may be interested in. In other words, okay, this application, what are its pieces, do dependency impact analysis. And we don't think that that's just interesting to straight developers. We think, especially as we tie into things like ServiceNow and ITSM and assets and so forth, that this is going to be extremely interesting to anyone who has to deal with the things not working. We need to know why it's not working. We need to know how it got to be not working, and then ultimately who can fix it and how do we prevent that from ever happening again. And that's really a comprehensive DevOps approach to things, right? And so we see ourselves very much as part of that. So radically more expansive dependency data allows us to see things we've never seen before. We've never, until we did that, and I don't think anyone on our team had ever seen sort of that clear picture of what it means to have a borked data model and how massive the ramifications of that effect are until our tool showed it to us. We've got source analysis tools, we've got schema crawlers, all that kind of stuff, but never did we see that notion that, hey, I changed this one thing, boom, I've got this huge problem. It's also going to now allow us to do predictive analysis and emergent use cases going forward. And not just in terms of fancy AI and all that, there are base level stuff that we can do from a pattern analysis just using graph. Before we get to that, those more advanced things that will allow us to say, hey, you know what? Maybe it's a deployment pattern. Maybe it's architectural. Maybe it's an issue around some notion of governance, but you need to do something. And you'll see in our product, we have this notion of governance wherein you can wrap rules around things. So we could pick, for example, that ID column that I showed you that exploded, and if someone changes, could blow up the entire world. You can wrap governance around that, put a rule that says, send an alert to me in Slack if someone goes and messes with that, and eventually tie that back into the DevOps process through the API. You could say, you know what, if someone touches this, block the build or block the deployment, et cetera. And so ultimately, we really think this is going to be interesting from a platform standpoint for customers and partners alike. And we are not anticipating that we're going to write every last piece of this infrastructure. We expect that a lot of people are going to be helping us along the way and interacting from a partner and customer standpoint. Finally, I want to talk about agent and data acquisition modalities. So how do we get that information? How do we build that up and so forth? So first, understand there's a backend that does all sorts of interesting magic tricks with regards to parsing data, figuring it out in various stages to do the stitching up of the relationship information. But out on the edge of that is this notion of an agent infrastructure. So first is we have a standalone agent that runs out of process. It's relatively low impact. The other modality we have is an agent as a library, and you'll see this come into play in a combination of scenarios where we're running in pass fast, and there's no actual server in the traditional sense, or you have an unmodifiable container that you're running your code in that is truly black box. So in that case, this would run in process. It would allow developers to have a degree of control over impact and instrumentation, and ultimately enables some of the dynamic analysis stuff that you would not want to do through injection or other methods. There is source analyzer work that we'll be doing as well. This will actually be coming relatively soon. And this is there's actually when we're talking about compiled languages, it's actually a need to combine that second and that third modality to get the complete picture. And we're having some interesting discussions on how do you get to a really clear level of fidelity. Symbols alone, if you're analyzing with symbols installed inside the process, it only gets you so far. You link it up with source, et cetera. And that's where our backend doing all of its fancy magic of taking different bits of information and stitching them together becomes pretty important. And then API access. So if a system has interesting dependency data, if you have a system out there today that has a configuration management database, that has dependency data that is, for example, deployed as part of an instrumentation package like Dynatrace and so forth, we absolutely are going to be mining that data as well. And that's part of us going up the stack, if you will. And then finally, where are we going 2020 to 2021? We're going to be doing a lot of stuff. I won't go over all of these things, but as we get through Q4 2020, we're going to be adding a ton of new additional agents and so forth. And one of the things we're very interested in is really trying to quantify which, so by the way, don't take any of the thing you see on the screen here as being gospel. In fact, some of these things have already moved around in terms of priority. But I put this up here to just give you an understanding of just how broad the scope is. And thanks to the remarkable work by people like Brandon, Rob, and so forth on our team, these are not just pie in the sky dates. We may hit them maybe a little bit later, maybe a little bit earlier, but we are talking within this time frame of the platform getting to this level of scope and coverage, which I think is pretty exciting. And ultimately, it will change the way in which we develop, maintain, and support software. Even within our own team, it already has had profound impacts. You will not be getting a product with certain things that should not have been included in a production build that would have if we hadn't actually used our own product to profile our stuff. And that's non-trivial stuff we're talking about right there. So with that being said, that sort of ends my presentation. I think at this point, I want to open it up to additional questions. Alex, how are we doing for time?
Fantastic, as long as we need.
Okay, cool. So we've had some good questions. Any other questions or things people want to talk about? Feel free to either turn on the mic or put it in the chat.
Well, Alex, maybe we do the lottery pick.
Yep. So when everybody came in, they were each assigned a number, and our friends at CrossCode were kind enough to donate 4 Amazon gift cards. So if I call your name, privately message Jennifer Morin so she can get your contact information, and she will send you a $50 gift card. Everybody ready?
I'm ready.
Oh man, come on, who's ready? CrossCode people, Verity people, sorry you're out of luck. But first one, Victoria. You win. So Victoria, send Jennifer your contact information and she will send you a gift card.
Thank you.
Number 2. Remy. You still with us? Last call, Remy. All right, Remy's out. Number 3. Carlos. Carlos Castilla, I see you here. You still with us?
Yeah, I was muted.
All right, you win.
Awesome.
Send Jennifer a private message and she will get you an Amazon gift card.
You know,
Will do.
Alex, I keep expecting my name to get called, but I realize that I can't, can I?
Ned, for that presentation, I will personally send you an Amazon gift card.
That's fine.
And play your song of choice.
There you go. I was good with the ZZ Top, by the way. I think Sharp Dressed Man's good.
It's a great lick. Anthony. Anthony Amos.
I
You
am
still
still
with it?
here.
All right,
Yes, I am.
send Jennifer your info.
Thank you.
And finally, Hamda, you still there?
Hello, I'm here.
You win.
Yay, thank you.
Thanks to our friends at CrossCode. Also, a couple of interesting items as well. For those of you that are interested, everyone that attended today that is still with us are very, very, very welcome to get a free trial from CrossCode. Jennifer, do you want to send a link in the chat for it, or should I have people ping you? What works better?
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat. It's also our email sign up. So we do send good content every now and then. You can also, not get that, but we have 2 options for everyone attending the call. You can get a free 90-day trial to try CrossCode for your company, or you can get a free single user license for 1 year. Both of these will be provisioned in October. We can certainly talk sooner if you're interested, but we'll capture information in this form. And it also outlines a couple of other events that we have coming up that are also free.
Awesome, thank you. And everybody, seriously, thank you very, very, very much for spending your lunch hours, your afternoons, for all the regulars from the meetup that I do know. Really grateful for your support. We're doing it again next month, and I can assure you we'll be doing a lot of awesome events, especially when we go back to the real world. CrossCode happens to have a ridiculously beautiful rooftop deck, so we'll be there again. We'll be there again. Anybody? What's that?
I'm looking forward to the day when we can use that rooftop deck. I mean, I hope the weather's still good when we do it. But I think we'll do it even if it's freezing. We'll make everyone go out there in the cold.
Not for
Or the
nothing.
city
To
will.
interact with other humans, I would actually wear a jacket.
I would do it too. Parka and all.
Let's do these meetups in person. So thanks for putting this together, Alex. Really,
I'm sorry, Greg. Can't hear you.
can you hear me now? Yeah.
Oh, I think I can hear you now.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everybody, and Alex especially, for putting this together. We miss doing the meetups in person. This is the best we can do right now. I'm grateful for your time. We've got a really exciting product. I really invite y'all to take a look at it. We believe it's really going to change quite different things that people are thinking about, how they're putting their software together, how they're transitioning team members, how they're making changes, how we're putting new features. It's real exciting stuff, and I hope you're as excited as we are. So let us know when we can schedule you to get started.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're really grateful for everybody. Ned, particularly, I know this was not an easy presentation. It's very exposing a lot of internal situations that didn't go your way. That's not the easiest thing in the world to do. So kudos, man. It was a great interactive presentation.
Very cathartic, though I will say.
It's a good time for self-reflection and getting it right and sharing your story with other people so they can learn as we go. It's awesome.
Great. Well, again, for folks out there, feel free to email myself or Brandon as well, even if it's just to talk about technology or the things that you're seeing out there. And if you start using our product, we love feedback, and we are, as we sort of articulated in terms of our DevOps story, we're pretty dynamic. So if you see things you want to see us do, if things aren't working the way you'd like to see that, we are absolutely interested in those conversations and understanding better how to serve the developer and DevOps community. So thank everyone for joining. It was a real pleasure to do this.
Thanks, everybody. I'll leave you with some outro music as everyone leaves. Let's get a couple of Slayer
Very
licks.
nice.
Nice.
I'm just going to stick around and listen to Alex go. Hey, Alex, though, can I ask a couple questions about the guitars on the wall behind you?
Absolutely.
So I grew up in a family of guitarists, and